Well, I'm afraid I actually disagree with you on the first part of the question. I think the reason why you had so much attention to parliamentary expenses, for example, is because it was such a flagrant abuse, which is open to lots of media spin and hyperbole in political commentary. People enjoy reading stories like that. Now, that tends to be the way, in general, that they approach politics. If you ask people what the kind of information that they have about politics, it's very often the trivia of politics, the kind of thing that does get into the newspapers about sex scandals, you know, what kind of sex act Bill Clinton did or did not perform in the 1990s. It tends to be that kind of thing which excites public opinion, or cases of outright corruption. The public choice argument would be that what is going on in terms of the detail of policy is what really matters in terms of the quality of regulation. Now, if voters have got very few incentives to even know who their politicians are, or have only got enough of an incentive to be informed about this kind of trivia of politics, the idea that you're going to get them well motivated and informed about the detail of policy, what actually happens on the floor of the House of Commons or whatever kind of legislative chamber that we have, on a public choice view, is fanciful. It's a structural defect of democracy that politicians are not accountable and cannot be made accountable when they face these kind of incentives. That's the reason you've got to choose between the market and democracy in many situations. And the claim would be, even imperfect markets tend to be better than an even more imperfect democracy. Well, the argument would be that you can't. In a sense, you have to recognize that we live in an imperfect world where people are self-interested and where institutions don't always operate perfectly. That is something that we may have to recognize. What we have to do is compare imperfect alternatives. So you have to recognize that the market isn't perfect, that there are going to be scenarios where markets break down. But before you jump to the conclusion that intervention will make things better, you have to look very carefully at the incentives that will operate in an imperfect process of intervention. And the public choice claim is that in many, though not necessarily all scenarios, the imperfections of politics tend to be greater than the imperfections of markets. So you may be better relying on an imperfect market. When you try to perfect it with imperfect politicians, that's when things really get screwed up. That's a very good question. That's a paradox, if you like, that public choice theory, if you look at the detailed literature on this, spends quite a lot of time examining. If you follow the logic of the argument, given that your vote's got no chance of affecting an outcome, why bother voting at all? The prediction of the model would be basically nobody would bother to vote. Actually, it wouldn't be that, because if nobody did bother to vote, then some people could be decisive in affecting the result of an election, so you would get some turnout. But nonetheless, it's a very valid argument to make. I don't think it's a particularly damaging one for public choice theory, or a difficult one for public choice theory to explain why people do actually vote. You don't have to violate the assumptions of the model that they're using. Basically, voting is a fairly infrequent thing. If you're talking about general election, you only do it once every 5 years. And in that kind of a context, frankly, for many people, it has a kind of entertainment value. It has a novelty value that you might actually enjoy, if it's only once every 5 years, going to the polls to express your preference. But that's pretty well all that your political commitment will entail. It's very noticeable to look that if you compare electoral systems, countries which ask people to vote more often tend to get lower turnouts than countries where people ask people to vote less often. And that would be a very strong implication that you would get from the public choice point of view, because the more you're asking people to vote, the more time you're asking them to put into it, even though the chance of them affecting outcomes isn't being increased, then it's more rational for them not to participate in those scenarios. And the entertainment value is going to be wearing off if you're doing it on a much more regular basis. Well, that's a different question. I mean, you could analyze the International Panel on Climate Change from a public choice point of view. The idea that climate science, I should say before I say this, I'm not personally a climate change denier. I'm actually willing to accept, on balance, although I'm skeptical of the evidence, that there is such a thing as anthropogenic climate change. Let me just make that clear. However, I think there's a strong argument to be made that people who are in these organizations who can get enormous amounts of government funding to fund the research have got very powerful incentives to inflate the rhetoric on climate change because they are going to be net beneficiaries of this research funding. So we certainly should be careful about taking these as purely neutral statements that are coming out from these bodies for public choice reasons. Well, I'd be very skeptical about that, about doing that. Well, yeah, I quite like cold weather, so I wouldn't mind if they come down either, but